This is True Crime Arizona, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.
Hi, everybody. Brianna Whitney here. We are joined by a special guest when it comes to everything with the zombie hunter, Detective Stuart Summershoe. I know you're retired now, recently,
Yes.
in December, but you actually reached out to me about Brian Patrick Miller. We were doing a lot of the reports, and I guess that's a good place to start is what made you want to reach out to us?
Well, I knew the case was coming to an end, that he was found guilty and all that. My part of the investigation was I investigated the Brandy Myers disappearance and murder. So when he was finally found guilty, I had kind of met that with mixed feelings. It was good to finally see this come to an end and that he would no longer be hurting women and children. But I feel that Brandy was probably one of his victims, and she's kind of been forgotten in all this. And she needs a voice in all this, I think. And she deserves to have some kind of justice.
And we've talked a lot about Brandy Myers on air, on the podcast, and the involvement or possible involvement of Brian Patrick Miller. He was a neighbor of hers, and she was, gathering money for a school book-a-thon. Can you just take us through the case of what happened to Brandy and what the Phoenix Police Department believes happened to Brandy, too?
This is back in May 26th of 1992. Brandy, as you said, was she lived in the a neighborhood, and she was collecting money for a school book drive. She lived in Sunny Slope. So she lived with her parents and her sister, and on that particular day, she was going to go out and collect money for the school book drive. And so she was had lived in this neighborhood for about 6 months, and her school was right nearby. She and her sister would walk the same path to and from school every day. And so she left to collect money for school book drive. We know she hit certain houses because these people came forward. And she was last seen about 2 houses away from Brian Patrick Miller's house. Now, the original investigation, Brian was never contacted. Brian wasn't in the case file or anything like that. It was only, flash forward to 2015 when he was arrested and his wife was interviewed, that he became a suspect in this case.
Why wasn't he interviewed in that first investigation, given that his house was so close?
Well, Brandy's case kind of, I think initially was treated as kind of like a lost, wandering child. As time passed, the thinking was something had happened to her. There was a false sighting of her away from her neighborhood that kind of refocused everything over to a different area of the city. I think that was one area where the case kind of got off the tracks. And then another aspect of this investigation is there was another serial killer at the time. A man named Scott Lair lived probably about a mile away from where Brandy lived and where Brian lived. I don't know if you've ever heard of Scott Lair.
I haven't, no. Scott
Lair was a serial killer who worked in Phoenix. Well, I guess not worked is not a good word for that, but who's victimized people in Phoenix from 91 to 92. So he was arrested in June of 92. So right after Brandy went missing.
So people thought maybe this was the work of Lair.
His MO was that he would pick up women in South Phoenix and then take them to the desert area north of Phoenix, where he would assault them. So there was 10 victims that were linked to him. 3 of them were murders. The rest were assaults and sexual assaults. So he became a focus in Brandy Myers' case. And he actually, during his process of going through the court system, tried to work out a deal where he would confess to Brandy's murder and then lead investigators to where her body was at. He was never able to do that. He took a polygraph, failed it. So we don't think that he's involved in her disappearance, but he became kind of the focus of the case. 2015, when Brian Miller was arrested and we knew where he lived and what he had told his wife, he obviously became kind of the focus of the case.
And did you interview his wife, Amy?
No, I did not personally.
You did not. In that case file, though, and what she revealed, what were the details that led you to believe what she was saying was true? And what was it that Brian relayed to her about possibly Brandy?
Amy's been interviewed multiple times, and she's very consistent in her story. She said that Brian confessed to 2 crimes to her. One was an assault in Washington, and the other was, and he didn't name Brandy, but he said it was a mentally deficient Girl Scout that came to his door when he lived on Second Place. And he basically said that she came to his door accidentally. He ended up stabbing her and killing her, and then he put her in the bathtub in his apartment and wanted to kind of keep her. Eventually, there was a smell that the neighbors were complaining about, so he ended up cutting up her body and putting it in the trash, and then she was rolled out to the curb and picked up by the regular trash pickup. So he didn't name Brandy as, I mean, he wouldn't have known her name until after, they'd all hit the news, but there was no other missing person cases that matched that description. And I mean, Brandy lived by him and was actually seen, like I said, 2 houses down from where he lived. And she was last seen heading in his direction.
And she's never been seen again.
Never been seen again.
So I know the Phoenix Police Department recommended murder charges against Brian for Brandy, correct?
Yeah, I filed a request to have charges against him.
And the county attorney's office declined to prosecute.
Right.
Why?
They said no reasonable likelihood of conviction.
How do you feel about that?
A lot of people have a conception that we're the ones that prosecute these cases. We are investigators and we make arrests. It's the county attorney who has to be in the arena of a court. And they when you submit a case, it's kind of, you go before them, you present it, and they ask questions, and then they, you leave the room and it's up to them. They discuss it. They discuss the strengths and weaknesses of a case. And basically, Brandy's case is a circumstantial no-body homicide, which is probably the most difficult homicide case to prosecute. So they chose not to proceed with it.
Now, in the file, reading everything, the interviews you did and all the investigations that you and the other officers and detectives on this case did, it says there was blood found in Brian Patrick Miller's bathroom. Can you elaborate on what blood that is and if it's relevant here?
Yeah, part of our investigation, once we had interviewed Amy, we decided to go back to that apartment. And this is decades after this event. There was other people living there. This apartment had been remodeled multiple times. So we're not looking at like something that happened right after the fact, but we still wanted to try. We did do processing. We pulled things off the wall. And in the corner of the bathroom, we did have a reaction to Blue Star luminol, which reacts to blood. And it was blood. It wasn't Brandy's blood. It wasn't Brian's blood. It wasn't any of the Canal murder victims' blood. We don't know whose blood it is. It's a mixture. It may not be related to this case or to Brian's case in any way. It may just be a construction man, cut himself while they were remodeling the bathroom or something like that. But it kind of raised our hopes there for a while, that maybe, we might have some solid physical evidence that would tie Brandy to this apartment and to Brian. But it didn't work out that way.
I know a lot of people hoped that Brandy would have been part of this Canal murders trial. I know her sister being one of them, but other community members, other people from the police department. Going through this trial, it was unlike most trials we've seen, just in the fact that there was no jury. It was a judge deciding everything. This lasted over 6 months, until we got this verdict of guilty for both the murders of Angela Brasso and Melanie Bernis, which I'm sure brings some sort of comfort to you, given the fact that Brandy was not part of this trial.
Yeah,
does it help?
Yeah, well, I mean, I know he won't be hurting any more women or children. And yeah, I mean, those families deserve that justice. And I'm not trying to, diminish that accomplishment. That's something major.
Sure.
But, when I was watching the news, I was kind of mixed feelings. I was like, I'm glad, justice has finally happened. But I spent a year of my life working on Brandy's case. I talked to her family, and I know how devastating her disappearance was. I would hope that I didn't want her to get lost in all this. I mean, she was a true victim, a 13-year-old girl doing nothing wrong, didn't deserve this. And, you know, Brian has done some horrible things, and, you know, his life is irrevocably changed now. So it's up to him whether he wants to maybe make some changes, and he can bring a lot of closure, a lot of answers to families out there, if he chooses to do that. I don't think anybody is all bad. You know, there's good aspects of Brian, and if he decides he wants to help and, you know, go a different way than he's been going, he could do that. You know, I think of Samuel Little, the most prolific serial killer in the United States. Before he died, he decided to give answers to a lot of families, and that they needed that. Brian could do that too.
We learned, you're good. We learned a lot in this trial about the Canal murders, more so than we knew years prior. We knew they were stabbed to death, but we learned how truly brutally stabbed they were. I mean, it was vicious. Mm-hmm. There were crosses cut into their chests and cuts all around their body, and we learned a lot about Brian's sex life, his fantasies that he had that he expressed to his wife were often rooted in violence. This pornography he had where people were dying or being eaten, and we learned a lot about he would, play with his now ex-wife's blood and eat that. Very disturbing stuff. But we didn't learn everything in this trial because not everybody's allowed to share everything, and there's parts that are not admitted into court.
Right.
Based on what we learned, what more do you know about Brian?
Brian Miller is a very disturbed person. You mentioned the crime scenes. I mean, that was some of the most disturbing crime scene photos I've seen in 26 years of doing this. But beyond that, he, as part of the investigation, when we started to investigate Brian, I mean, he was very active in social media, and he had a DeviantArt account, which is a website where people collect art and images and things like that. There were dozens of images of homicide scenes, of women being decapitated, women being tortured. Within his home, he had a lot of images of sadism, cannibalism, necrophilia. So that is an aspect of Brian's interests, I guess you would say. Some of the other things that, besides that, I didn't ask Brian about this in particular, but one thing that came up in the case was that a lot of his social media tags were the Duck 13, Lucky Duck. That was what names he used. And one of the things we did in our investigation, he had an Amazon wish list, and where most of it was innocuous, things that he was interested in. He very fantasy oriented. He was into Doctor Who, Star Wars, things that everybody else is interested in. The zombie things, yeah, it's a little weird, but a lot of people are into that. But if you look at his Amazon wish list, there is a series of movies that he liked or wanted to put on his wish list. And a lot of them were 80s slasher movies. And again, and I'm not saying that any of this caused Brian to be who he is and all that, but obviously it feeds his fantasies and reflects some of the things that he has interest in. So one of the movies on there is I think it's a 1982 movie called The New York Ripper. It is an Italian slasher movie. The director, I think, is, I'll probably mispronounce his name, Lucio Fulci, kind of a famous slasher director. So in The New York Ripper, and I don't mean to be a movie critic, it's not a good movie. It's not well made, it's not well acted, it's not well written or anything like that. But it has very stylized sexual violence in it. And the killer in that movie, he calls himself the Duck. And he calls the police, and he'll speak in a duck voice. Quack like a duck. And when he's attacking victims, he will quack. It's a very strange movie. And one of the victims in that movie is a female who's riding a bicycle. So there are some parallels or some things that may have interested Brian. I don't know. I don't know when he saw this movie. But it was something that came up in the investigation that was, I guess, interesting. What this, like I said, I'm not saying that Brian saw this movie and suddenly became a serial killer. But obviously, it probably at some point in his psychosexual development, he probably saw it and it impacted him, I think.
And there were other movies on that wish list, too, that were very concerning.
Yeah. A lot of 80s slasher movies, where it's a lot of violence against women, and he was really into that. So.
On the cannibalism, necrophilia route, do you believe that was just a concerning thing he was into, or do you believe that he may have carried something like that out at some point?
I don't know. Cannibalism was an aspect in some of the stuff he was into that he was looking at online and things like that. One of my personal theories is the zombie hunter. People are into zombies and Walking Dead and all that, but Brian was really into it, and it's almost a socially acceptable way to talk about cannibalism, eating people, because that's what zombies do. So whether that's something that, appealed to him, I don't know.
But it's something you've thought about.
Yeah.
It's definitely concerning. Where do you, it's interesting, in the trial, everything surrounded was he insane at the time or not? Mm-hmm. And obviously the verdict was he was not insane at the time. When you're going through a case like this, how do you differentiate between disturbing and legally insane? Because the normal person might look at all of this that you're talking about and be like, this is crazy, this is insane. But legally insane is a different thing. So
right.
How does that work when you're investigating?
Well, when I'm investigating, when I'm interviewing people, mm-hmm. I asked them, did Brian ever not remember things? Did Brian, have, blanks in his memory or anything like that? And nobody reported that. When I interviewed a lot of people, in the cosplay world and the Mennonite world. A lot of them were like, you got the wrong guy. That he is a nice guy. You guys have made a terrible mistake. And I think Brian enjoyed that feeling of being among people like a human shark almost. And that when I interviewed him for like 2 hours, Troy Hillman and I did. And, if you didn't know anything about him, he's very nice and affable to talk to. And he would describe himself as, not liking blood, not liking violence and all that. But, I knew what he had done. I'd seen pictures. I knew what he was into. And this idea of having a split personality, I didn't really, it's a smart, I guess, or clever defense, but I don't think that's a reality for Brian. I think Brian, based on what we saw, what he was into on his social media, on his in his house, that's who Brian is. He just doesn't want the whole world to know about that.
He's good at masking it.
Yeah.
And in your interview, that is a significant chunk of the Brandy Myers case file. I think your interview's like 90 pages.
Right.
And he's a big part of the Brandy Myers case file with your interviews with other people that knew him. When you sat down and talked to him, what did you take away from that? Was there anything that stood out about what he said or how he acted or his demeanor towards you that has stuck with you ever since?
We interviewed Brian in May of 2015. So he was arrested for the Canal murders. And so he had retained a lawyer in that matter. We were talking about a different matter. So had to be very careful that we didn't discuss the Canal murders or anything like that. So we talked about Brandy. My challenge was getting Brian to talk to us because he really didn't have to. And so we brought him in, and by that time I interviewed a lot of people and knew a lot of background about Brian. So I knew that he was very fantasy oriented. I knew some of his interests. One of his interests was the Doctor Who show, which I really didn't follow, but I knew somebody who did, and they had a TARDIS keychain. I don't know if you know what a TARDIS is.
I don't, but I assume it has something to do with the show.
So Doctor Who is a time traveler, time lord.
Okay.
And he, I guess, travels in a like English police box. It's called the TARDIS. And so it's kind of a significant icon in the Doctor Who world. So I took that keychain and I put it on my cuff key link. And so when Brian came in, when I unhandcuffed him, I made sure that was hanging down. So he saw it and he's like, "Oh, TARDIS, do you like Doctor Who?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, I do." And we started talking that way.
So that was very strategic on your point.
Yeah, well, I mean, I wanted Brian to talk, and I wanted to learn more about him and all that. So I read him his rights. He agreed to talk to us, and we interviewed it was Troy Hillman and I for over 2 hours. A lot of that was just talking to Brian about things he liked and getting to know him a little bit. And we talked about Brandy. And eventually, when we started to get in kind of the hard details of Brandy's disappearance, I mean, and he remembered the event. He said it was significant in the neighborhood, and he, admitted he had heard about it and things like that. He eventually said he didn't want to talk anymore. One of his lawyers, so we concluded the interview.
So he didn't say anything that, I don't know, would have led you to
nothing incriminating.
Sure.
Nothing that would say, hey, talking to Brian is interesting because, like I said, if you didn't know anything about what he had done, you would not. He's very soft spoken. He's polite, and like I said, he's affable. You wouldn't mind talking to him if you didn't know everything that we suspected him of. So, we spent a lot of time talking about topics he was interested in. He talked about his mother and his experiences with her. We talked about his sex life a little bit, and some of his childhood and his experiences. But when it came to Brandy, the only things he would say was that he knew that she had disappeared in his neighborhood. He claimed he had never met her. He remembered the police response to it. He remembered a Mac van being there and all that. But part of my interview, I asked, what would you, do you think Brandy's still alive? And he's like, no, after all this time, I don't think so. Who would you look at, as a suspect in this case? Probably somebody in the neighborhood was his response. So, but when we started to kind of get more into it, hey, this is where Brandy was last seen. This is where you lived. You probably have some information here. And he's like, I think I want my lawyer now. And that was the end of it.
Did he ever answer anything more about Brandy?
No. Oh. After that, we were done talking, and that was the end of the interview. Wow. So, again, Brian can make some choices now, and Brian can, give some answers and resolution to this family if he so chooses.
Do you believe there are any other suspects in Brandy's disappearance and death?
No. I wouldn't have submitted charges on Brian Miller if I didn't think he hadn't done it.
Do you think there are other victims of Brian Patrick Miller's, both in Arizona and anywhere else in this country?
I believe so, just based on what I know about Brian, how the depth of his depravity. I mean, the crimes that Brian committed, we have multiple gaps in his history. 1989, he stabs Celeste Bentley when she's at Paradise Valley Mall. He's in jail for a time, and then 1992, Brandy goes missing, and Angela Brasso is murdered. 1993, Melanie Bernis. Then there's a gap, 93 to 2000, when he is in Washington. Victoria Melkinson is stabbed and attacked. He hasn't been charged with that, but it's suspected he's involved in that. 2002, Melissa Ruiz Ramirez is stabbed and attacked by Brian. He is arrested for that, but he's acquitted ultimately.
Also in Washington State. In
Washington State. So he serves about a year up there while he's waiting for trial, and then he comes back to Arizona. 2003 to 2015, when he is finally arrested for the Canal murders. So there's long gaps in his history where we don't know if there's other victims.
Is there a chance he stopped in those?
Yeah, I mean, there's always. I mean, you look at other serial killers, BTK. He had long gaps in his history too. Brian, as young as he was, and as depraved as he was, I find it hard to believe he was able just to stop. But I don't know. I mean, I would have to say, knowing what I know about him, there probably is more victims that we don't know about or we haven't identified.
Do you consider him a serial killer?
I do. That's my personal opinion. It's not the police department saying that. It's me, based on what I have learned about him. Yeah.
And is there any more insight you have on his zombie hunter getup? I know, obviously, you said it. You believe it was a.
Well, I mean, he's very fantasy oriented. He's into horror, and I mean, he's into Star Wars. He's into Doctor Who. I think he enjoys attention too.
I would say people liked him coming to events as the zombie hunter.
Yeah.
Like that was a kind of popular thing.
Yeah, and again, he can. I think he savors that moving among people without them knowing who he really is, and that's part of his persona, part of his what excites him, I guess. I don't know, but he definitely, it's an aspect that was a big part of his life. I mean, a lot of the people we talked to, again, they were certain we had the wrong person. He's so nice. He would never do anything like this. But you have that weird, fetish he has with these horror movies and this interest in that whole world.
Before we wrap up, I know you were talking about Troy Hillman and how much of a huge role he played in this case. And the two of you guys, just in general, too, with the investigation. Can you just talk a little bit about what worked for you guys and how groundbreaking this all was when it happened? Because there was genetic genealogy used, and that was pretty new, and there was a whole undercover operation to get Brian Patrick Miller's DNA. I know a lot went into it. So from your point in this investigation, you and Troy Hillman, what did it mean to you to be able to work with him and get Brian Patrick Miller to the point where he is now, which is convicted?
I tell everybody Troy Hillman solved this case. I mean, if it wasn't for his tenacity, his dedication, these cases may not have been solved. And he deserves a lot of the props in this, I guess, win, you would call it, I guess. But without him, eliciting Colleen Fitzpatrick, this may not have been solved. Without him keep pushing, his team and us to get answers for these families, he may not have been identified.
Could have still been out there.
Yeah, and then you have victims who don't have answers. You have victims who don't have justice. Their families suffering, and then you have possibly other victims who are going to happen.
Yeah. So
that he deserves a lot of credit for solving this case. And I know when talking to him, he's passionate about cold cases, and that's a big thing. I mean, look at this case as an example of how important cold cases are. How many people did Brian Miller affect? The whole community, in fact. I mean, he instilled a lot of fear in a lot of people, and then plus the families that were victimized, who suffered years and years not knowing what happened and, not having answers. So cold cases are so very important, and right now we are in a staffing crisis in law enforcement. Every department across the country is hundreds and hundreds below what they should be. People aren't coming into this job, and a lot of people are retiring. I retired. Troy Hillman retired. And so when you're looking at that level of staffing, management has to make tough decisions about what's going to be, where we're going to focus resources. A lot of times cold cases get cut because, we have to focus on what's happening right now. So this case should be an example of why we need to focus on cold cases and why it's so important. Like I said, justice for the victims, answers for families, and prevent other victims in the future.
Is there anything else you want to add on it? Or him?
I mean, like I said, there's so much about this case, so many aspects of it that probably you could spend years talking about this case and about him. Again, Brian needs to make some decisions about where his life is going to go. I mean, he's going to be in prison the rest of his life. Does he want to try to make some good in what he's done? I mean, he's done some terrible things, and he deserves the punishment, but he can still give answers to families out there, that other victims. He could cooperate with law enforcement and help us understand what creates a Brian Miller, you know. And I don't know what created Brian. I mean, he claimed his mother was very abusive towards him, and I believe that. Other people have gone through the same experience, not ended up as a serial killer. So maybe Brian give us some insights into how he ended up down that path, that very, very dark path that he went down, and maybe we can stop it from happening again with other people. There are probably other serial killers out there that we don't even know about, and they're getting smarter. They're getting more understanding of the techniques we use to identify them. So, and also Brian was very young when all this happened. I mean, he's a teenager. He was exposed to some very violent pornography. Kids these days have even more access to it. So Are we creating more Brian Millers out there now? I'm sure we are. Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming here and sharing everything. I mean, you're right. There's so much to him and the case and the victims that we could go on and on for hours and hours, but I appreciate it. And it just helps shine light on things that we've learned about him and also the victims too. And I think you make a great point that, you know, this is justice for Angela Brasso and Melanie Bernis, but we don't want to forget about Brandy Myers. And it's nice to be able to at least include her and learn a little bit more about her and the case through you. So thank you for that. True Crime Arizona, the podcast, is hosted by me, Brianna Whitney.
And me, Morgan Lowe. It is a production of 3TV, CBS 5, and azfamily.com in Phoenix, Arizona.
This is True Crime Arizona, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.